Welcome to the Center for Humanist Inquiries class on Beyond Belief. This is the second class in the series entitled Accusation. I'm super excited about today's class. It's good stuff in the essay. So before we dig in, just to give a little bit of review, last class we covered the key terms that Ricoeur uses to entitle his essay: religion, atheism, and faith. Ricoeur's definition of religion is that it has corrupting elements in it, and there are two in particular that he's worried about: the fear of accusation and the desire for protection. And from his perspective, both of those need to be purged and need atheism in order to really root out what's corrupting about them. Given his definition of religion, though, in terms of its logic of taboo and protection, a lot of secular society actually fits that model. So a lot of people who aren't quote-unquote religious or not quote-unquote believers still have that desire for protection and that need to call certain things taboo and to separate themselves in a way that has nothing to do with myth and ritual or the sacred even necessarily, but nonetheless adheres to that logic of religion and in particular its corrupting influences. So one important thing, even for those who aren't religious, to take away from the class is that Ricoeur's logic of critique and atheism definitely applies to even secular ways of being. The second standard, or second definition, second word was atheism. And again, the two atheists that he was most compelled by were Freud and Nietzsche. And he believes that atheism is useful in clearing away the corrupting elements, but as a site of critique, it tends to linger there. So what he's looking for is not atheism as an end goal, but atheism as a means to an end of what he calls faith, the third term, which is what results after corruption has been removed from religion. Okay? So that's a little bit of a review. In terms of a preview for today's lecture, just to kind of give you the skeleton of what we'll be doing, there will be four basic parts. First of all, we'll talk about how Ricoeur lays out the logic of accusation and shows its limitations. We'll then discuss the three main questions of atheism. Third, we'll trace the importance of remaining inquisitive and look at how Ricoeur focuses his inquiry on the subject of language. And then we'll conclude by talking about how, from the perspective of language, Ricoeur articulates a space for ethics that precedes the rational drive toward duty. Because atheistic critiques largely center on the interposition of the rational on the subject, and the sense of, the latent sense of accusation that remains because of that, he believes that language and our hearkening to word might supply an ethic that won't be hampered by an atheist critique. Okay? So we'll get into that, and that will hopefully make more sense by the end of class, but that's the direction in which we're headed. So first of all, the first major question that he asks in this part of the essay is, how do Nietzsche and Freud undermine the traditional ground of religion? His claim is that, in general, they distinguish error from illusion and lying, right? So if you have error, illusion, and lying, for Ricoeur, error is always where the will overshoots its own truth, right? So you have your will that drives you forward, here's what you know for sure, and error comes when you outstrip what you know for sure. It's a mistake, and we're fallible according to Ricoeur. So that's okay. Lying is an intentional form of deceit, but illusion is more of a form of self-deception. It's a kind of mistake or a kind of attitude that we're not as aware of. And so by distinguishing error from illusion and looking at religion as being a kind of illusion as opposed to an error, right? It's not a computational mistake, it's not a typographical error. It's a different kind of untruth that both of them are differently able to unmask. Ricoeur says, quote, "Illusion is itself a cultural function. Such a fact presupposes that the public meanings of our consciousness conceal true meanings, which can be brought to light only by adapting the attitude of suspicion and cautious critical scrutiny." Okay, so illusions tend to be cultural in nature. And because they're cultural, we grow up assuming they're true, and it needs to be unmasked. Okay? So that's how they do it. In terms of their specific methodologies, he discusses the philological approach, where both Nietzsche and Freud are interested in deciphering the text under the surface of consciousness, right? And so, because these illusions are so widespread and because they're so latent, what they do philologically is look at the language underneath, what's written underneath what we're conscious of. And again, both Nietzsche and Freud have different ways of doing that, but that's one way in which their atheism really provides a necessary critique. The second method he discusses is genealogy. Genealogy considers the fact that the text appears as distorted to consciousness because of a conflict of forces or drives whose origin must be clarified. Quote, the genealogical task is to reveal the emptiness of the source, a possible source, or better, an empty place from which ethical and religious values emerge. Okay? So what he's postulating is some sort of religious subject who's sitting here, whose ideas and consciousness end up coming out kind of garbled, and there's a filter that interposes between the subconscious and the conscious. I mean, Freud talks about this in one way, Nietzsche talks about it in another way. What they have in common that Ricoeur is pointing out is that it presupposes a need to have some sort of higher source of values that make them a capital V value, right? That credit that value with some sort of absolute trueness with a capital T, or rightness with a capital R, or something like that, that makes that value an absolute value and certainly true. And what both Freud and Nietzsche are interested in doing is not looking at the question of this so much as the question of the person who needs that to be true, right? And that's how they're successfully able to unmask a lot of our need for certainty and a lot of the drives that corrupt that need for certainty and make it so that it needs to be certain. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. He then discusses Nietzsche and Freud separately. So Nietzsche, according to Ricoeur, bears witness to nihilism but does not create it. He is not a nihilist. He's a prophet of nihilism, right? He just testifies or attests to its emergence in culture. Nihilism emerges when recognizing the emptiness of the ideal, or either the ideal in a Platonic sense or supernatural realm in a religious sense, as an origin, quote unquote, of prohibitions. The ideal does not exist, right? So nihilism comes when there's a whole cultural system of values predicated on some sort of ideal truth. And nihilism results when there's a big X over that truth. So everything that was assumed to be full is now empty, and then nothing has any meaning anymore. And then if you're a fan of The Big Lebowski, people carry weasels into bathtubs and wear all black and speak in big German tones, but that's not the point. So that's Nietzsche. Freud introduces the superego as a source of moral consciousness. And the superego internally provides both prohibition and condemnation, right? For Freud, the superego is the inherited or what's the word? Internalized set of moral norms that one punishes oneself with as a way to control and check the id, which would let you do whatever you wanted all the time. So the superego for him becomes that ultimate source, not something out in the sky or something out somewhere, but it's really an internal problem. And therefore, for Ricoeur, Freud adds to Nietzsche a very personal dimension, right? It's not just a cultural thing, as Nietzsche analyzes, it's also an internal, very human thing that we do. So overall, for Ricoeur, one, both Freud and Nietzsche agree that the concepts of good and evil are created by means of projection within a situation of weakness and dependency. Okay? Humans are weak, we're fragile, we're vulnerable, we're dependent. And the best way to overcome that is to create a system, I mean, it's what Nietzsche calls slave morality, right? It is to create a system where when you're weak, you overturn the values of strength and to call piousness and humility and nonviolence as good and to declare brute force and things like that as evil. It's a very 30-second reduction of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. Does that do the trick? Okay. So, but it's that notion of projection that puts a capital letter in front of good or true or value or something like that. And that's what we project it up so that we feel better about ourselves because we're weak and we don't like to be weak. Number two, both Freud and Nietzsche agree in a transvaluation of values as a response to that. Although Freud adds the personal element to this, which is the rejection of the father in an Oedipal sense, right? And so for both Freud and Nietzsche, if this kind of thing turns into a good, what was originally for Nietzsche a good versus bad, right? Bad people are just weak-willed. They're bad the way that art is bad, right? Like, it's kind of mediocre art. You can have mediocre people. The good people are the people who know what they want and they just take it no matter what. The initial transvaluation of values occurs in the slave revolt of morality, where what was good is now considered evil, and what was bad becomes good. And for Nietzsche, that's the institution of the priestly class, right? That kind of thing. The answer to all of this, though, is to do another transvaluation of values and go beyond, in Nietzsche's terms, go beyond good and evil, right? Leave those terms behind as bad thinking altogether and move forward into a more joyful future, or a more joyful science, or something like that. All right? So that's the first part of today's reading. Any questions about that? I know that was kind of fast. We okay? Okay. So what sort of atheism do Freud and Nietzsche articulate? When they say God is dead, as Nietzsche does, what's really behind that phrase? And what what Ricoeur does is ask three questions. One, what God is dead? Two, who has killed him? And three, what authority belongs to the announcement of the death? We'll just go through these one by one. So, what God is dead? The God of ontotheology. And that's one of those nifty big words. Onto is just being. Theology is the study of God, theos. So, the God of ontotheology is the God that can be proven, quote unquote, by using existence or by equating God with being. Right? If you think of theology as a game of shift, like that game where you put like a little marble under the cup and then you mix all the cups around, something like that. It's one that all of a sudden you're talking about God and then the proof relies on being, or the concept of being, instead of the traditional like Judaic God, the Hebrew God, or the Christian God. It just becomes into being, and that's the kind of God that dies. Number two, the process exposes how the God of duty, which is based in any sense of ethical obligation, is grounded on a basic accusation, right? So when you take out ontotheology and this notion of being, that uncouples the notion of being equals this kind of good, or this kind of moral duty, or this kind of imperative. And once that's uncoupled, then all that's left is the sense of accusation. Okay? And what Freud and Nietzsche do is show how the fear and desire transforms the resentment of the weak into a sense of volitional autonomy that can choose good over evil. So because of that, this is going back mostly to the genealogy of morals, but it's that notion of a slave morality that looks at will or volition is that which can opt for good instead of evil, or what it calls evil, and makes that choice of opting, or that notion of volition in the will, itself the kind of the linchpin of determining whether or not you're a good person. Okay? And that's the way they try to escape from accusation. Make sense? Question two, who is the murderer? There is no agent or figure that kills God, quote unquote. It's the working out of the absolute nothingness at the heart of God. It's baselessness. Okay? So for those who are grounded in the secular world, one way you can think about it, this isn't Ricoeur, but it's the working through of suspicions about government that suddenly allow you to realize, wait, nobody's actually authorizing the government to make the laws that it's making. Nobody can authorize any one police officer to enforce laws in one kind of way as opposed to another. And once you see that whole framework of authority in political life or political thought is totally baseless, then suddenly a huge nothingness strikes through and it really destabilizes the force of law in any given country, right? That's the kind of nothingness at the heart of God that Nietzsche sees, or Ricoeur claims that Nietzsche sees working out through the death of God. Does that make sense? Okay. Question 3. What authority belongs to the announcement of God's death? And here's Ricoeur's take on it. First, Nietzsche is a rebel. He's not a prophet. He's not the Superman. He's not the Übermensch that he talks about. I mean, that's Zarathustra. It's not him. He says, quote, Nietzsche's major work remains an accusation of accusation, and hence falls short of a pure affirmation of life. Right? He's critical of the corrupt parts of religion, but he doesn't affirm anything. He's just really, really good at showing what's wrong with what's there. The authority that Nietzsche has is limited to criticism, and maybe at most the conviction of his criticism, but nothing positive emerges from that, right? Nietzsche's stuck in a critical space where he can, it's the twilight of the idols, and he can throw his hammers at them, but there's nothing that's left. He just turns everything to dust and rubble in his wake. But then Ricoeur makes this point. He says, on the other hand, the, quote, only one path has been decisively closed off, that of an ontotheology, which culminates in the idea of a moral God conceived as the origin and foundation of an ethics of prohibition and condemnation. Right? Nietzsche does a great job of showing why that God doesn't exist. And what it means that God doesn't exist is that paternalistic God of accusation, prohibition, condemnation, judgment, that God doesn't exist either. But that's the only path that's closed off. And when you think about religion, that leaves a whole bunch of stuff open. Right? I mean, that's one path, that's one way of thinking God in the West, and that's one little path that's been closed off. Okay? And so what Ricoeur says is that this is a positive development. Quote, we are henceforth incapable of returning to an order of moral life which would take the form of a simple submission to commandments or to an alien or supreme will, even if this will were represented as divine. Right? So we're freed from that. We don't have to go back to that because they make some really good points. Right? And the fact that one path is closed off, we might be nostalgic for that path. There's a lot of certainty in that path, right? It's like Lebowski's rug, right? It brings everything together in a nice harmonious sense. But it doesn't work. Not ultimately. Not if you really, really let yourself think about it and be open to that critique. Right? So we might desire the certainty or the comfort or the nostalgia or the community that this path leads to, but the fact that it's closed off is not a bad thing. All right? So those are the 3 questions that Ricoeur asks about atheism. Any questions about that?
So is it kind of like the God that has been killed is an authoritarian God?
It's the marriage of reason and revelation. So the reason comes out from the philosophical traditions that theologians have picked up, and revelation comes out of the scriptural. And both philosophical norms and revealed communities have a heavy emphasis on how to behave properly, right? And so whether it's Kant's critique of pure reason, which comes up with a categorical imperative that says this is what morality is, this is what our duty is, or whether it's the 10 Commandments, whether it's the Golden Rule, well, whatever it looks like, there's an emphasis on how we can be good people that's always involved. The theological traditions have tended to try to blend these together to create like a super absolute certainty, right? So you can believe in revelation, you can believe in philosophical reason, you can believe in the truth that both of those paths give you access to, but a lot of theologians doubled down and tried to merge both of those together super hardcore to make it super absolutely, positively, absolutely certain that this is how you should be. And so what he's saying is that we can just leave that behind now. It's okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Moving on. Ricoeur then asks, can we recognize any religious meaning at all in atheism? And he makes two interesting points in here. First of all, he qualifies his earlier statement about faith. And he says, quote, "Only a prophetic preacher with the power and freedom of Nietzsche's Zarathustra would be able to make a radical return to the origin of Jewish and Christian faith, and at the same time make of this return an event which speaks to our own time. Such preaching would be both originary and post-religious." Right? So on the one hand, he holds open the fact that there might be a figure who can return to those roots and bring forth out from it something that's new, that's originary, that speaks to its time, speaks to its culture, and appropriates it in that really powerful way that like Thoreau would appropriate the Greeks, right? To really own and speak of it in a way that's fair both to the tradition and to the time that it's being spoken in. And in some ways, I mean, you can look at what Jesus does to Moses as being one example of that, right? Jesus does nothing but reiterate the law of Moses, but the way in which it's reiterated is far more appropriate to that time than the law of Moses, right? Nietzsche, in some ways, looks at himself as doing the same kind of thing that Jesus did to Moses, but he's doing it to Jesus, right? It's that same reiteration that changes it drastically without actually undoing it. So for him, it's possible to do that. He's just not the person to do that because he's not a preacher. He's a philosopher. The second thing that he says that's pretty interesting that I wanted to just kind of foreground is this, and here again is another quote. "Sin itself would appear as the opposite of a life ruled by grace. Sin, then, would mean life ruled by law, i.e., the mode of being of human existence which remains caught in the infernal circle of law, transgression, guilt, and rebellion." Right? And so he's saying in a once we get rid of this, right? This is gone. Well, what's that leave us? What it leaves us is a world of grace. And that grace is good. And we still have a concept of sin that we can look at, and sin becomes that really heinous loop of judgment and accusation and rebellion and forgiveness and sin, right? I mean, and guilt and shame. And it all just appears in this vile circle. That's sin. And that's turning our back on a potential for grace that would free us from those sorts of traps. Does that make sense? To me, that's a beautiful thought of what emerges after atheism. Go ahead.
So you go beyond good and evil, but it's not like it's a return to good and bad.
No.
Because like if the good person in that Nietzschean sense of taking what you want would set up laws.
Or wouldn't even bother with laws, right? I mean, for Nietzsche, there's nobody less interesting than the brutes who are good. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, it'd be like me just saying, I'm really big and tall and I have a big beard, and I want Andrew's computer, so I'll just take it. And what's Andrew going to do to me? Nothing. I get your computer. Right? There's no need for laws at that point. I can just take because I'm big. You know, but for Nietzsche, they're incredibly boring people. And the good for Nietzsche of the slave revolt and morality is that it made us interesting. Right? We become a lot more introspective and a lot more reflective. And there's no way that Nietzsche would ever advocate a return back to good and bad, because that would forsake everything interesting that developed in the wake of religion. You know, so instead, what his ideal is something that goes beyond that, and in a lot of ways, I think is Ricoeur's use of grace is his way of talking about the Übermensch, right, or somebody like that who is beyond good and evil, who's unfettered from that notion of law and guilt and rebellion and that orientation toward things. And it's just free and a joyful life. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now we come to the second part of today's lesson. And here's where it gets interesting, and here's where I'm going to erase the board. So the task for Ricoeur is this. It's to continue asking questions, right? Ontotheology's loss reveals a lot of questions that answer had covered up, right? If you don't look at that as a true answer, but is pointing to something else, a whole world of inquiry opens up. And Ricoeur is mostly interested in interrogating language. Okay? So he starts out with this. He says that the philosopher cannot be the preacher that's demanded to bring a post-religious age into order, right? Again, he's the philosopher, he's not the preacher. The philosopher remains a cultural institution. A second point that he makes, nihilism is not over, because we still mourn for the loss of the gods. Last time we talked about that period of confusion that atheism ushers in, right? And we're still in that age of confusion. We still mourn the loss of gods. We still have a nostalgia that pulls us back toward it. Because there's something really simple about accepting guilt as true, right? Or knowing that you're condemned, and then knowing that there's forgiveness. It makes everything so easy, right? To have that sense of absolution and be purged of it. And even if you sin again on Saturday night, every Sunday morning, forgiveness awaits. And you can rejoice because you're born again, right? And you can do that over and over and over again and never get anywhere. But that cycle's so comforting, we miss it once it's gone. We want it back. And so that's why we're in the state of confusion. For Ricoeur, the good philosopher remains suspended between atheism and faith, right? Philosophers don't deal with religion per se. They're out of their element there. They're suspended here, right? They understand the critique and its importance, but they don't hover there because they have convictions that need to be expressed or that need to emerge. So they're hovering here. They're after the stage of atheism, they accept it, but they're not content there, right? They want to push forward into a state of faith. And for Ricoeur, that's philosophy. Here's a quote. He says, the philosopher's responsibility is to think, that is, to dig beneath the surface of the present struggle between reductive hermeneutics and a positive hermeneutics of repetition until he has discovered the level of questioning that makes possible a mediation between religion and faith by way of atheism. Right? So you don't want a reductive hermeneutics that makes the answer too simple, and you're not yet to a point of a repetition that allows, the way that Jesus was a repetition of Moses, right? It was a meaningful repetition, not a parroting of the same words or phrases over and over, right? So between these two, the philosopher needs to dig beneath the surface of the present struggle until there's a level of questioning that opens up a new way. And given that that's the task that he assigns to the philosopher, he then makes good on the task, and he decides to do a little detour through Heidegger. So here we go with Heidegger. Three things about Heidegger quick. First of all, he goes to Heidegger because he wants a movement to language. And he argues that via Heidegger, that a relationship to word opens an obedience devoid of ethical implications. Quote, we must try to gain access by means of a non-ethical approach to the problem of autonomy and obedience. Two, he talks about hearkening as an attitude that allows this. Hearkening for him is a pre-ethical stage. It's a mode of being which is not yet a mode of doing, and which thus avoids the alternative of subjection and revolt. Three, he says, word occurs. Something is said of which I am neither the source nor the master. So here's kind of what this looks like. If you have an imperative, you have the choice to obey or rebel. And that puts it in the world of acting. And that's already framing it in a very traditionally moralistic sort of way. Right? Here's the imperative, do this. To be good, do this, and avoid that. Well, now I have that choice. And this is the system of ethics, right? Any ethical system gives you a set of imperatives that you need to either abide by or reject. And then take the consequences of that as you will. What Ricoeur is saying is that before we even get to that, because this is at the world of acting, that word itself occurs. And in its occurrence, we can hearken to it. And there's a relationship that's open, which is an obedience in hearing the word and just hearing it. Just listening to it itself is an ethical possibility. It's a pre-ethical possibility, right? It's a mode of being which allows a certain kind of goodness that never gets trapped in this at all. So that's what he takes from Heidegger, and then he starts to develop it. So, are we okay moving on through the development? Okay, I think this will make more sense as we go also.
I guess one quick question, isn't that hearkening kind of like a pretty temporary way of being? How could you do that forever?
How can you not?
I don't know, you just learn the rules and follow them.
But what if you're always hearkening?
How?
To listen, to wait for word to speak, and then to attend to the speaking of word. Wait on it. Ask me again at the end of class.
I will.
Write it down. Okay. So on page 450, he talks about language as an alternative to accusation, right? Because he's still trying to figure out a way past accusation, and the way that he wants to do that is through language. So here are two quick quotes and then a summation. The first quote: "In the occurrence of word, I do not have anything at my command. I do not impose myself. I am led beyond the feelings of anxiety and concern. This situation of non-mastery is the origin of both obedience and freedom." Right? When you hear a word, you don't have to be controlled or controlling, right? You're receiving the word, and the word comes outside of you, but before you become anxious about not being the speaker of the word or concerned about what the word might mean, you hear it first. Right? And you're not in control, but you're not being controlled. There's nothing to rebel against at this point, right? There's no accusation or condemnation. You're hearkening to it. It occurs, and you're part of its occurrence. You receive it as it occurs. 2, prior to all moral instruction and all moralism, we perceive in the act of hearkening the foundation of other modes of listening, following and not following. This hearkening implies a belonging to, which constitutes pre-ethical obedience, right? So if like I have a daughter, and I can ask my daughter, did you listen to me, or are you listening to me? And what I mean by listen is really, are your actions along the lines of what I have spoken, right? To listen to me means behaving in a certain way. But what Ricoeur's talking about is another mode of listening. Again, it's this one over here, right? It's the hearkening form of listening, which it's a belonging to. It's an obedience, because you can obey the summons of word to listen before you can figure out what to do to act, right? And it's that shift to the pre-ethical that he's interested in making through Heidegger. Keeping silent, and this is number 3 for Ricoeur, is the origin of both hearkening and obedience. Right? And he talks, he quotes a lot of Heidegger throughout this section, but you can say a lot of words and not be silent or not prevent, right? It's not about whether you're speaking or not. Keeping silence is a way of preserving a space for something to be said. Right? It's not a lazy attitude. It's not acting nonchalant. Right? It requires a lot of intentionality to really hearken to the world, to really be listening, and not watchful, because that's ocular-centric, right? But I mean to really listen for anywhere in the world where a sound might be uttered or a word might be spoken that you could obey and then think about. But obedience isn't this kind of listen, right? Obedience is just part of that hearkening and keeping silent. We okay to move on another step? Okay. The importance for ethics is this. 1, an ethics that exists prior to the morality of it opens up an ethics that exists prior to the morality of obligation. It's an ethics of the desire to be or the effort to exist. Okay? And he goes back to Spinoza for a lot of the background for this. According to Spinoza, ethics is the process of moving from slavery to freedom and happiness that involves conatus, which is the unfolding of effort as itself. Okay? So that the desire to be or the effort to exist is a natural emergence that doesn't, it's a struggle that's not that kind of like ontological moral struggle, right? It's just the effort that it takes to become who you are, to be as you are, and to allow that to emerge. Ricoeur also indicates how desire needs to be worked in, replicating the Platonic eros. Ethics requires affirming being in spite of our innate nothingness. Most structures philosophically, most philosophical or theological anthropologies discuss human beings as having some amount of nothingness and some amount of being within them, right? And that nothingness is the reservoir that allows us to have potential, right? This piece of chalk has very little nothingness to it. It's all actuality. Humans aren't like a piece of chalk, right? There's a nothingness that we have that allows for certain things to be presented, created, destroyed, and negated that's fairly unique. And so for Ricoeur, the ethics that he wants to build out from Spinoza is an affirming being in spite of an innate nothingness. 2, Freud and Nietzsche, for Ricoeur, tackled moralistic substitutions of reason for desire and happiness as a drive for action. And they're right in doing so, right? So what he's saying is that whereas Spinoza looks at the effort to be as a path toward happiness, which is something desirable, right? I mean, that's good. That's not the normal ethical model, right? The normal ethical model says thou ought, and it gives you all the reasons for that ought, and those reasons have very, very little to do with human desires and happiness, right? And in fact, they're often opposed to what one might desire or what one might think would lead toward happiness, right? And so he's saying that Nietzsche and Freud say that's wrong. He's like, great, yeah, you're right, that is wrong. But there's still a space for ethics. Ricoeur sides with Spinoza in believing that humans are fallible instead of corrupt. We're not born evil, we're born fallible. We make mistakes. And that's okay. But in seeing us as fallible instead of wholly fallen or wholly irredeemable or wholly in need in this sort of ought-based correction, Ricoeur wants to embrace a model for ethics that comes before the interposition of reason, right? Or duty, or law, or things like that with all those capital letters. He's trying to advocate for a different model. So the importance of word is what he starts talking about on page 454. One quote is this: "Word has the power to change our understanding of ourselves. This power does not originally take the form of an imperative. It's altered by a listening that understands." Right? So when a word is spoken, it has the power to change us in a way that doesn't have anything to do with rules or duty or ethics. You know, so if I say, "Jim, you look beautiful. You look beautiful tonight." And if that word speaks to you, if you're hearkening to it, that sense that I am beautiful, just that word shapes things. I mean, do you feel that just a little bit? Sure. It shapes things. And it's not that you obey the word beautiful the way that you'd obey, like if I demanded that you make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something, right? I mean, it's a different kind of obedience. If you hearken to that phrase, you're beautiful, you're good, something like that, right? That's the kind of obedience that he's talking about. That's the power of that language has to change us if we're open to being changed. And that's the foundation of the pre-ethical way around accusation that he's looking for, right? It's that hearkening to word or language or the power of language to just totally alter how we see things. I mean, how many of you have had one of those like random words tossed out at you throughout a day that's radically changed the course of that day? It's no one word or no other word, but something really resonates with a word spoken. It's just kind of uttered in a thoughtful rather than a thoughtless manner that really affects you. And that's what word can do. And when we obey the invitation of language to reorient ourselves, That's the kind of obedience that he's talking about, right? And that's what gives us freedom. It's the freedom to opt toward the paths that those kinds of words open. But there's no, I mean, you don't rebel against it. I mean, if I said, Jake, you're beautiful, then you're like, I mean, that wouldn't make sense to rebel against that, right? I mean, it's not that kind of prohibition. There's no accusation. There's no demand. It's just language opening up and allowing a kind of freedom, introducing to you something that hadn't been in your world before. And then you're like, wow. And if you really let that settle through, it can really change your whole life. Powerfully and profoundly. Words have power. They're important. And that's what Ricoeur's returning back to. Number 2. Our modification through word precedes the principle of obligation in acting upon us. Here's another quote. This intimate connection between our desire to be and the power of word is a consequence of what we have referred to above as the act of hearkening, of paying attention, of obeying. Right? So we have the desire to be, we have the power of word, and what Ricoeur's just saying is that we can harness these together, right? To understand the power of language and to hearken. To listen to words, to listen to what language can do. And it's not even a spoken word necessarily. I mean, how many of you have read something that's reoriented how you think through things? Changed your worldview, giving you an insight that you hadn't had into your own situation existentially, right? It just jars you, it frees you, it opens up new things, it shakes away some of the things that have calcified, and it liberates you to be something more. And what Ricoeur's asking is a pre-ethical stance is just to be open to that. To hearken for those words or toward those words that would have that kind of liberating potential. To be thirsty for them. To be aware that they exist. So that's that. 3 implications for today's lecture. Number 1, I think what Ricoeur does in this section is to think through the implications of critique. Even those critiques that have conviction behind them, the way that Freud's and Nietzsche's do, in order to see their limitations, right? I mean, a critique is really, really damaging. Like, anybody can go on the negative and point out all the flaws of something. It's a really powerful kind of position. But what Ricoeur is willing to do is to see the limitations of that kind of critique in order to show that there's nothing positive that it offers as an alternative. And what he's interested in the world of confusion left after critique, is what positive things can you name? And it's the task of a philosopher to name those positives and to point them out and to spell out a path through the confusion that people can follow. To remain convinced of critique. And so last time, again, we talked about conviction and critique as 2 possible models, right? I mean, people like to have conviction that what they know is true, or people like to critique those things and say, you don't have the truth, da-da-da-da-da. A lot of times we want certainty, so we'll tend to sway in one direction or the other, right? You'll have the rebels who think everything is false, and you'll have the believers that think that everything is true. But for Ricoeur, it's always a dialectic that moves gracefully from a critique to a conviction of something that's truer, but that itself is susceptible to a bigger critique, right? Which leads to a more clear point of conviction. And you're always making progress. But you're not sticking only to one, right? And so in order to move from critique to conviction, you have to have something positive to think through and offer, right? To take something determinately true out from a negation and to open yourself up to that as a possibility. So that's number 1. Number 2, I think this part of the essay allows us to understand how to think through problems to a more fundamental and more basic framework, which can illuminate new possibilities that later structures overlook. Right? So his method of moving past accusation is not to just say, no, Freud and Nietzsche just never had a true moment with God. Right? I mean, that's not going to answer their critiques. Instead, what he does is it grants their critiques, but look for something more fundamental. Right? And in this case, more fundamental than our relationship to law and commandment and imperative is our relationship to language in general and our ability to listen. And even at that very gentle, basic level, there's something beautiful that can emerge, which is a powerful alternative to that world of accusation. Right? So questioning through to that point is sometimes really, really helpful, especially if you can do it well, which I think Ricoeur does. And then number 3, there's a beauty to a stance of openness and listening and hearkening. A hearkening soul never feels accusation as a belated sting. Being open to becoming moved is a mode of non-control that remains distinct from being powerless or controlled, right? If I'm just vulnerable to words, if I'm vulnerable to language, if I allow myself to be moved by music or dance or the stars in the sky, right, or whatever, right? If I'm open to being moved, I'm not in control of myself anymore, right? I have to let down my guard. I'm not going to control anybody else when I'm in that mode, but it doesn't mean that I'm in that mode of like obeying somebody else or rebelling against them, right? It's a more fragile, but I think far more beautiful way of existing that I think is underappreciated in today's society. Any questions?